Okay, so in ancient Mesopotamia, there were exorcists as well. These were people who, just like the exorcist in the movie, would remove demons from people's bodies who were being afflicted by possession, by, let's say, evil spirit. Another thing that practitioners in ancient Mesopotamia would do was to tell the future or to use divination. Sometimes these would be used to, let's say, answer a question about an upcoming battle. Other times, they would be used to figure out what was wrong with a patient. And particularly, people in ancient Mesopotamia used the livers from sheep to determine the future. So they believed that essentially, in some ways, the future was set, but that they could determine what was going to happen in the future through some sort of oracles. The gods would communicate to people through the use of oracles, such as the shape and form of an animal liver. So they might sort of ask a question, sacrifice that sheep, remove the liver, and then use things like this model, which has cuneiform writing on it, which describes if there's sort of an abnormality in this part of the liver, or if the liver's this particular shape, this is what it means. So it's like reading tea leaves, except you're using a liver. And so you could get an answer to a question, such as what is this patient suffering from, and then figure out the proper remedy. So this kind of sets the scene here. Here's someone looking at one of those clay models of a liver with cuneiform on it, sort of get the answer. Maybe a healer over here and the patient lying down over here. And then possibly, again, either two gods or priests clad in these sort of fish kind of like garments. All right, now let's talk about the royal tombs of Ur. This is one of the most interesting finds in Mesopotamian archaeology, and it was discovered a few years after the tomb of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was discovered in 1922. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. The royal tombs of Ur were actually identified in the same year by Leonard Woolley, who was the head of the excavations here. His wife also, Catherine Woolley, was very important in the excavations. You'll see pictures of her side by side with Leonard Woolley excavating the royal tombs. Hamoudi here was the head of the Arab workers from the village who worked at the site of Ur. This is Max Mallowan, who's kind of a young assistant, and he is the one who met Agatha Christie when she visited Ur, and they ended up getting married. And Agatha Christie wrote her book Murder in Mesopotamia and based it partly on the royal tombs of Ur. But one of the interesting things was Leonard Woolley was a very patient archaeologist. He identified the royal tombs in 1922. He knew that he had just reached the top of an area and that had started to reveal things like lapis lazuli and gold, but he didn't feel the workers and the team were skilled enough to work on something so important as that. So he actually had them work in a different area, and he waited 5 years before he went back to this area to excavate it properly. So Ur was a very important city in ancient Mesopotamia. The patron god was Nana, who was the moon god. Ur today is in the desert. Back then it was surrounded, on most sides by water, very close to the Euphrates, and in fact it had two harbors right in the city. So in those harbors you could imagine the boats that would have left, gone down the Euphrates and then out into the Persian Gulf to trade with other areas, as well as bringing of materials down the Euphrates from further north. You can get an idea of some of the huge amount of material that in some parts of the royal cemetery that Woolley had to excavate in order to get down to some of the earliest remains. This is Murder in Mesopotamia. Here's Agatha Christie visiting the site with Max Mallowan. Here's, again, Leonard Woolley. So yeah, Catherine Woolley was indispensable on the site. Here you can see them excavating some sewer drains. These are made out of clay. They nest within each other. They're go straight down and then out of the site. He's taking some measurements. These are from a later period than the early dynastic. And here you can see a picture of the whole entire excavation team. Okay, so back then, the main part of Ur was, of course, the temple. You can see here the famous ziggurat, which actually dates to later than the early dynastic. It probably replaces an early dynastic ziggurat. A later residential quarter he excavated here. And we're going to be talking about that when we look at the period after the Ur 3 period coming up. But he excavated an entire neighborhood of houses. It gives us a real idea of city life in ancient Mesopotamia. And so near the temples was this cemetery. This gives you an idea. When we go back here, you can see the two harbors right here. Right? So this allowed access through a canal to the Euphrates. This one was very close to the Euphrates. So this is maybe what Ur might have looked like back then. You can see it's really, it would have been an amazing city for the time. So not too far from the ziggurat was the cemetery. So from this aerial photo, you can see the cemetery is located here. This is showing you the cemetery before it was excavated. Part of the cemetery was cut into by this later wall. This is a picture showing you some of the excavations of the cemetery during that. And you can see the amount of earth that had to be removed here just to get down to the cemetery. Okay, so the burial ground was used for about 1,000 years. Because it was used for so long, graves were sometimes cut into earlier graves, built on top of other graves. It was sort of hard to divide it up into discrete time periods, but he was eventually able to come up with a relative order of the different graves. Some of the earliest and the lowest in height were 60 feet below the surface of the mound. So all in all, they found 2,000 burials. Most of them were of regular, ordinary people, simple graves. Basically, person in a kind of reed box with some pottery and maybe some jewelry. But of those 2,000, there are different periods, remember. 750 were from the early dynastic period. And of those, 16 were what Leonard Woolley called royal tombs. And we'll talk about why he classified them as royal tombs. Right? So here you can see all these little squares are commoner graves, small. And you can see here, it's these stone chambers. These are the royal graves. And so having a stone room or stone edifice was one of the characteristics that he used to classify it as a royal tomb. So it's pretty amazing. They worked there for about 5 years, and they would dig about 300 graves per season. Again, it was very difficult to sometimes figure out what graves were oldest, what were youngest, but I'm going to show you sort of how he was able to do that. Okay, so this gives you an idea of some of the area of the cemetery and that later wall that cut into part of it. So one of the things that he did was he looked at the iconography and the artwork from the cylinder seals that were in some of the graves. Based on the writing that was on them and based on the art styles, he was able to kind of put them in order. He was also able to use stratigraphy to put them in order too, right? So, you know that if something is, on top of something else, it's most likely younger. If it cuts into something else, it's most likely younger. If something is underneath, it's older. So he could use stratigraphy to try and figure out the relative. And again, he wouldn't get an absolute date, but he would get a relative date. And he would use some of the art to also get kind of a date of these different cemeteries. Okay, so these royal tombs were a distinct group. Why were they distinct? We're going to talk about that. Some of his terminology, you'll notice that these graves usually say PG and then a number. PG just stands for private grave. He also uses this term death pit. Death pits are, well, you're going to see what one is. It's a large area with lots of people buried together, but no tomb chamber of an individual who is sort of set apart. Okay, so what made these royal tombs? Well, the amount of wealth that was in them. That was one thing. The second thing were the structures themselves. So those stone boxes, stone buildings, and also the evidence that some sort of ritual took place there at the funeral. Not all of the royal graves had all three of these characteristics, right? So some of them did, as we'll see, but some of them did not. But they were still classified by him as being royal. Okay, here you get an idea of some of the early work in the cemetery, excavating some of these graves. And again, some of the earliest and one very deep part of the sounding. You can just see, how it's pretty amazing when you look at just how far down they had to go in order to get down to some of the earliest graves, right? And they had to, essentially create steps in the earth stratigraphy here so that people could climb out with the basket loads of dirt. A lot of the work was very meticulous. They all took very careful notes, detailed plans, so he had a really good idea of the precise location of the finds within each within each burial. He didn't just scoop it all out and and sort of analyze it later in the lab. He was very careful and methodical. All right, well, let's look at some of these graves, what was found in them, and then what we can interpret from that. Right? Okay, so here's one particular grave. It was of a royal person. Some people think it was of a specific king or Pablasag. It's not exactly clear if it was or not. Some of these kings who have been identified from names that were on bowls or on cuneiform or on cylinder seals, some of them are not listed in that famous kings list that we looked at before. But the very first kings of Ur that are written down in history date to this time period, around 2500 BC. Okay, what was interesting about this tomb, and it looked like it had been disturbed and parts of it had been looted, but in this area they found a box that was covered with lapis lazuli, with red limestone, and also shell. And this was something that Leonard Woolley called the standard of Ur. He thought it was a standard that you might carry on a pole. It probably was a box for a musical instrument. It was reconstructed. And one of the interesting things about this standard is it has two sides to it. One is the side of peaceful scenes, as you can see here, someone playing harp, people sort of at a feast, one particularly large figure over here, people leading animals and carrying goods. And the other side are scenes of war. So again, a figure who's larger up here, soldiers, these chariots that were pulled by wild donkeys called onagers. This is before they had horses. Leading captives. Here you can see captives, probably from a battle, being led away by the soldiers. And here, these chariots are running over the corpses of enemy soldiers. So people had several different interpretations of what was going on here. One is, was it showing sort of duality, peace and war? That was one interpretation. Another interpretation, some of the interpretations involve the large figure and the interpretation of that figure being the king. So another interpretation is that these are maybe it's a victory monument to one campaign, that this is the battle and this is the celebration after the battle. Another idea, we're going to be talking about kingship this week and also partly next week. But kings had different names. One was called En, which is essentially like Lord. And the other is Lugal, which we already talked about before, which means great man. En tend to be sort of associated with civic and religious responsibilities. Lugals tend to be war leaders. So maybe the standard of war is showing the dual nature of kingship. That is, kings as civic and religious leaders and also as war leaders. Okay, so we're going to continue looking at some of these finds.